All right, is that okay to start? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Committee on Affordability Accounting and Planning meeting. Please be advised this meeting is being broadcast over the internet and is being recorded. That's item number one. Item number two is consideration of approval of minutes from September 27, 2000 committee meeting. Any questions, any discussions?
I'll make a motion to approve.
I need a second.
Second.
Yeah, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? This motion is passed. Agenda item number 3 is consideration of approval of consent calendar. This consent calendar includes non-controversial items that can be approved without comments or discussion. This allows us to save time for other items that need more of our attention. The consent items are highlighted in gray on the agenda. The following items are on the consent consideration. Agenda item 5G 4 through 5G 9 for proposed rules. Are there any such items that anyone wants to move or remove from the consent calendar? Any questions? I need a motion and a second, please.
I have a motion.
I'll second.
All in favor and say aye. Any opposed? Agenda item number 3 is passed. Item number 4 is public testimony on agenda item relating to the Committee on Affordability and Accounting and Planning. We do not have any public testimony. Agenda item 5A is a report on data highlighting 60 by 30 completion targets concerning high school to college enrollment and male completion. Dr. Julie Eklund, Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding, will provide a presentation on both these completion targets. The item is only for information only.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anwar. This morning, I have a two-part data highlight for you. My staff has been busy. I'm going to be sharing data with you related to targets under our completion goal. We'll first be looking at the direct from high school to college enrollment rate, and then we'll be looking at male completion. By 2030, our target is to have 65% of Texas public high school graduates enrolling directly into college. However, this target has been declining for the past 2 years, from 2014 when the plan was first published. The trend in the high school to college rate varies by region. From 2014 to 2016, the 4 most populated regions experienced a decline 2 years in a row, with South Texas having the largest decline. It's also interesting to note that Central Texas experienced the fastest growth in high school graduates. So although the matriculation rate decreased, the number of students enrolling directly after high school graduation did increase, as you can see on this chart. We're up in terms of the overall graduates quite a bit. In terms of those enrolling in higher ed, we're up, but again, we're down to that 52% in terms of the proportion. And so we've spent some time exploring why our percentage is going down. So I'm going to start by discussing some trends in the Texas high school graduate population. The demographics of public high school graduates continued to shift as Hispanics still represent the fastest growing segment. The proportion of Hispanics increased by 2 percentage points since 2014. And all of our race ethnicity subgroup populations did experience growth in the number of high school graduates during this 2-year period. Growth among whites was less dramatic, with only 1% compared to the 8 to 11% increase seen in other groups. So that's why whites have had a proportional decline. Consistent with previous years of data, Hispanics and African Americans continued to have the lowest direct from high school enrollment rates, with Hispanic and African American male having the lowest rates, followed by white males, then African American, Hispanics, and then white females. It's interesting to note that the white enrollment percentages are higher than for the Hispanics, but the size of the Hispanic population is larger, and therefore more Hispanic students are enrolling directly from public high schools. In fall 2016, there were about 16,000 more Hispanic enrollees. Oh, and another thing I do think is interesting, if you look at those enrollments, though, our Hispanic students are much more likely to first enroll in a 2-year institution than a 4-year institution. Our white students are more likely to enroll in a 4-year institution than a 2-year institution. Overall, economically disadvantaged students matriculate at lower rates, particularly those who are male. We see a greater percentage of Hispanic high school graduates being economically disadvantaged versus our white high school graduates. And again, because this is the largest population in Texas, it's really important to note those differences for our economically disadvantaged students. I think we really need to make sure we focus on available funding for our economically disadvantaged students in terms of our recommendations to the legislature and other priorities. And we want to make sure those students are aware there is money available for going to college. And finally, this chart shows by our major population group some of the gaps in enrollments. Our non-disadvantaged whites have the highest enrollment rates. Our disadvantaged whites have the lowest. But as I mentioned before, this is a smaller population in our overall high school graduates. So the increase in high school graduation rate has contributed to the increase in the number of high school graduates, and two major policy changes that affected the class of 2015 and 2016 that were not in effect for previous cohorts include the option for students who entered high school in the 2011-2012 academic year to optionally graduate under the foundation program rather than the 4x4 program, and also the implementation of individual graduation committees. So I'm going to talk about these a little bit more later. So what staff did is they examined the factors contributing to the changes in college enrollment, and basically they determined that if we'd continued on at the same rate where we were in 2014, we would have had 7,000 more high school graduates enrolling directly in higher education. So what this chart shows is the breakout of where those students might have come from, what might have caused this drop. We did see about 12% of that little group that we think should have enrolled but didn't. 12% of them were students who had actually already completed credential through dual credit, either a certificate or an associate degree. But when we looked more carefully at that data, 80% of the students who had completed some kind of a dual credit credential in high school did go on to higher education. But there was that 20% that completed and then we didn't see enrolling. We did see that about 35% of that drop can be attributed to those individual graduation committees, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then, of course, the graduates opting for the foundation program made a difference. But 18% of this change we weren't able to explain, and I think that's important to understand that we have, in fact, seen a drop. So graduates under the individual graduation committees in the foundation program had lower rates of direct from high school to college enrollments. If these graduates had rolled in college at the same rate as the other grads, we would have been at 53.6% enrollment, so just 0.6 under where we were 2 years ago. So again, even though we can explain some of the drops by these policy changes, it doesn't explain the whole drop, and we need to be increasing rather than decreasing in terms of the direction.
Explain what the individual graduation committee is versus the foundation.
Yes, thank you. So the individual graduation committee, these are committees that were allowable by law in the 84th legislative session, where if a student has not failed, if a student has not passed, I think it's 2 of their high school graduation tests, the assessments that are required for high school graduation, a committee can get together, look at the student's record, this is at the high school, and make a determination if they will allow that student to graduate. And when we looked at the data for those students enrolling into higher education, we saw only about 20% of those students enrolling. And of those students, I think we just looked and only about 3% were college ready. So these are students who weren't able to pass those graduation tests, but the determination was made that they could go on and graduate. And they do look at grades and other information about the student for that. So again, that was a 20% enrollment rate for those students versus our 52% overall. The foundation program is something that's students who were under the 4x4 could then opt for the foundation because of some of the changes in the graduation plans. They have higher college enrollment rates, I think it was about 47%, but they're still not up to the 53%. Those could be students who were planning to go to college but just decided they didn't want to take a particular course under the 4x4 and decided to do the foundation, or there might be various reasons. So again, trying to understand some of these differences.
Just to be clear, because this is all kind of new in understanding, because these numbers definitely affect. Mm-hmm. And, when we did the Star Awards and we were talking about, with a lot of the community colleges, their challenge for what comes to them, and who's prepared and who's ready. And so, trying to understand where this pool of students, what their capabilities are and what we would need to do to get them to a level. If on the individual graduation committee, I want to make sure I have this right, you said 3% were college ready.
Right, that we found when they did enroll, of that 20%, we had 3% that were ready.
Of the ones that enrolled.
Right, and most of those students were enrolling at community colleges, the vast majority, and some of them wouldn't have had to have tested for college readiness because they were enrolling in level 1 certificate programs. So of those that we had data for, 3% were showing as ready. One thing I think it's helpful to know is that there was legislation passed in the last session requiring us to track the college enrollment and outcomes and workforce outcomes for students who graduated under those committees. So I think people are looking to see what, moving forward, how
Right.
these students are doing.
And one thing that's important that this be included is when you're calculating the percent of graduates that are going on to higher education, these are students that prior to these committees would not possibly have been high school graduates at all.
Right, so I got that. So
They're
we're
included as part of the calculation, even though it's probably less likely to begin with that they would.
So
be
you're
going to
saying,
college.
all right, let me make sure I have this right, David. So what you just said was prior, so they wouldn't have graduated, so they wouldn't have counted as potential, or what?
They would not have counted as high school graduates if they didn't graduate.
Gotcha.
So this it is at least on the margins, a marginal increase in the total number of high school graduates. And so we look at what percentage of the total high school graduates, whatever program they graduated in, enroll immediately in college. So this is just, it's a small factor, but it's still letting you know that this we would have anticipated that this might have had at least a tiny effect on the percent going on directly to college. Am myself too convoluted in that?
No, I think, I understand. I had that question, Ms. Eklund, as well. On page 5 on your graph, the 12%, the dual credit credentials.
Yes.
You know, as far as, I think what Chairman Jenkins is saying, I think I have the same question that Bobby does, is that 12%, I mean, they've also got an associate's degree, but it doesn't count towards higher education?
Right, so when, that's actually not correct. We certainly count those students' completions, but when we were developing the high school to college target, the methodology for it, we only included those students who had graduated from high school and we had found enrolled that following summer or fall in higher education. So because they hadn't been included, we'd been asked to look and say, well, what percentage of students may be already completed? But that isn't included right now in terms of how we calculate that.
That is not included.
It's not included at this point.
That was my
That's
question.
correct. And that's why we wanted to look and see what those numbers look like. And again, it's a very small, it's just 12% of that, 4%, and trying to understand who isn't going into higher ed, who would be reducing our numbers.
So the strategic plan, though, the goal of 60 by 30 doesn't delineate between high school graduates or not, right?
In terms of the completion goal, that's correct.
Right.
So the completion goal, we count all those completions.
It's just all those people that age group.
Exactly. But this
Right.
particular target, we're just trying to get a feel who's enrolling directly. And we do see many, as I said, a very high percentage of students who have completed a credential with dual credit going on to higher education. And we were happy to take that deeper dive and see those students moving on.
Okay, and so what's foundations and what's 4x4?
Okay, so the foundation is under the new plan, and I'll,
Whose plan?
The high school, in terms of the public high schools, those are the graduation plans that students can graduate under. And the 4x4 was the older plan where students had to take courses for 4 years in science, math, social studies,
so
and
is this-
English language arts.
That's that now you have to opt in to be on a college path?
These are the endorsements that were established by House Bill 5. I forget what session it was. But now, it used to be the case that students had to opt out of taking the 4x4 plan, which is 4 years of English, 4 years of math, and so forth. Now they have to opt in, so that college preparation is not automatic. It has to be explicitly sought by the student and his or her family.
That's basically the baseline, and for students in these particular cohorts, they were kind of during the transition period from the 4x4 into the endorsement program. So there might be some unusual things that have happened with that population where they didn't choose an endorsement, but they dropped to the foundation. So that's why we wanted to look at that and see if that explained some of our differences.
You could think of it as the minimum program.
Foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's not the 4 years of English.
No, it's not. It's not. And so this analysis is important because we really need to monitor what's happening with the new graduation requirements as we go forward. And it's really just the beginning. And work closely with TEA, who is concerned about people being college ready, and to make sure that if we see any sort of canaries in the coal mine, we can alert them and vice versa. So we have to work closely with them on that.
Julia, I was, and this isn't an exaggerated term, I was astonished by the slide on the bottom of the page, bottom page 4. We know that there's a discrepancy between students that are economically disadvantaged and those who are not in their access to college. But the numbers for white students are incredible. There's a gap of 8% for African Americans. There's a gap of 6% for Hispanics, and there's a gap of 22% for white students. We have to find out why that is.
Yes, and we will continue to dive more deeply into this data to understand.
You know, when you hear about the large percentage of white males that are disaffected about their position in American culture, this gets right to the heart of it. We need to understand why this is. Is it because they're not being told about financial aid? Is it? We need to find out why.
We need to find out
what's happening.
Well,
I think part of it is this population isn't typically targeted in special programs.
Well, clearly we need to start targeting.
But in Texas,
Yeah.
in Texas, we've seen the economy improve. These kids can get out of high school and get a job, and a lot of white males join the military. I've just seen that pattern all through the community that I work in, the community I live in, that a lot of times, even in the Hispanic families, the males are pretty much expected to go out and get a job and contribute to the families. So if there are jobs available, why would they go to school if they don't feel like they could succeed or could actually pay for it? And that's really, I think, some of the issue that really we don't do a good job with these kids in 8th grade, 10th grade, and when they are graduating, and parents really want them to bring some money into the household. So I don't see it as much of a mystery, especially when the economy is doing this. If there were no jobs available and there was nothing else for them to do, they might look at a second option.
And we did see it.
That's absolutely true, but I think part of the point the commissioner was making, if I'm not mistaken, was that there was more difference in racially than he would have thought. And because I think those factors you cited are correct, but they cut across all the ethnic groups, and so we do need to know more about that. And I just want to point out that one reason why we have these presentations, and we will all through the plan, is we just don't assume things were as they were when we started the plan, and the staffs, one of their main goals is to go through and dive deeper and deeper and know more and more, so you guys can suggest policies that can help specifically address things as they arise, or even make adjustments in the plan as we go forward.
Julie had one other question. You use the term focus on available funding, right? You use the term, to focus on available funding,
Yes.
right? So I just have a question. Of the available funding, of all available funding, right? Is there a pot that's not getting accessed or getting utilized or not, is there money that's not being used for what it was intended to be used for.
No, when we were looking at this data and talking through the presentation, we were talking about the fact that, we really made a lot of efforts to make sure that poor students, economically disadvantaged students, were aware of where money is available, to focus them and counselors on the fact that there are resources for folks to go to college. And when you look and see still these large gaps for economically disadvantaged students, I think I wanted to make the point that it's important that we we keep our attention on making sure those students are aware of the money that's available.
Absolutely. I was just wondering, because you hear about so many different organizations that have scholarships, right? The Rotary has this, each one of them. There's just a whole bunch of things out there. I just was wondering, is there a compilation of all those? And is there any data that says X percent of them don't ever get accessed or utilized? Because I do think there is a lot of messaging that needs to be done that says there is funding out there, this is obtainable. But my question is there a gap there that is or isn't there?
Julie can answer that particular question. I just wanted to point out that it's become evident to me as we've talked about this plan around the state and emphasized when seeing this data that with closing the gaps, we realized early on that there was some belief that there were people that didn't understand the importance of going to college, and that was not true. What was true is they didn't understand there was money to help them, and so we put some emphasis into that, and it seems to me that one thing we haven't talked about is sort of renewing somewhat that campaign to, even on our end, to make people aware there are places and who to go to in terms of the institutions and other groups such as you're suggesting for money. But at the same time, we have to continue the board's continued efforts to have adequate money there for them. We don't want to tell them there is money and not have sufficient money. And that's been, as you know, a challenge that you guys have taken on continuously over the last decade.
And we do have information in our College for All Texans website about where there is money for college, and a lot of those resources. We try to pull them all together in one place for students. So I want to continue on and address some of Ms. Shepard's comments about the economy and what's happening to students, because we then said, okay, let's look at those students who aren't enrolling. Now we've kind of understood what's happening with their graduation, but let's look at where they're going. So we found 6% of those are enrolled out of state, and we did the presentation for you earlier about the National Student Clearinghouse data showing that we've been pretty consistent. So although we thought maybe that had been the increase in why our drop was there, we realized that wasn't the case. But what we have found is that there's been an increase in students that we're finding in the Texas workforce. So they're not enrolling in college, but we're finding in the workforce. That percentage is up. And then we're also seeing a larger percent that we're not finding in the workforce or in college. Though one thing we did talk about is that there are more people working independently. We talk about the gig economy, that there might be people out there driving cabs, people who were not getting their employment data. So it's important to consider. But here's something we thought was really striking, is that we are seeing more women entering the workforce than we did in 2014 and not going to college. So that the male percentage has stayed the same for those going into the workforce, but it's increased for our female population, and it's the highest for African American females, followed by Hispanics, and then whites. So in terms of takeaways, I think that we spent quite a bit of time talking about the policy changes at the secondary level that have affected the high school to college transition rate, and we understand that might explain some of the drop, but not all of it. We see more women who are entering the workforce and not enrolling, and that's certainly something we need to understand more about. We see economically disadvantaged students and male students continue to have the lowest enrollment rate, and I think we really need to think about higher education and K-12 continuing to work closely together to prepare and support students if we're going to reach that 65% target for direct from high school to college enrollment. And we need to increase that number if we're going to reach our goals. So let me just move forward into our next presentation, and this is kind of a tie-in. This is about male completion, which is another of our targets. As you know, by 2030, the completion goal is to achieve 550,000 certificates, associates, bachelors or masters, and you'll see them represented as CABMs up here, just because that takes a lot of space. So we aim for half, or 275,000 of those credentials for male students, because male student completion significantly trails female student completion in higher education. To reach our completion goal, we need to increase participation all around for all groups, but particularly for those that are underrepresented in terms of our completion goals. As you know, that includes Hispanic students, African American students, male students, and economically disadvantaged students. So what is the gap for male? In 2016, females completed about 185,000 credentials, while males completed approximately 135. That's a 50,000 gap in credentials, and it represents about 16 percentage points. So national research suggests several factors may be related to the gender gap. The gap appears to be driven more by increases in female completion rather than a decline in male completion. Women began earning more BAs nationally than men in 1981, and it rapidly accelerated in terms of what they were earning and then leveled off in about 2000. The gap has been pretty similar for bachelors since then. We see a similar trend, for example, with doctoral degrees. Women began outpacing men there in 2007. The gender gap is a very complex issue, and there's a considerable debate in the field about the causes and remedies. These are just a few factors listed here, drawn from some current research that we took a look at from the Pell Institute for the Study of Opportunity in Higher Ed, and from some academic research at Ohio State, Kentucky, Northwestern, et cetera. So we just wanted to share a few of those things, but there's a lot of research and information out there on this complex topic. So we can see that some of these national trends in differences are related to early achievement gaps in our 8th grade cohort analysis. We thought we'd look at this and see what the gaps look like. For our most recent cohort of 8th graders, there were 8,000 more males than females in 8th grade, approximately equal numbers at high school graduation, but there were 11,000 more female completions for that group in higher education at the end of the 11 years. In terms of percentages, that means 17% of the male 8th graders completed a higher ed credential by 2016, compared to 25% of the females. Here we present completion numbers broken out by race and ethnicity. You can see the darker blue bars representing men are higher in only one category, and that's international students. They have close to 4,000 more males than females in terms of completions. Among all the other categories, female students outperform males, often by sizable margins. For example, you'll notice both white female and Hispanic females completed in higher numbers than white males, and the gap between male and female is highest for our African American completion. This graph presents completion data by gender and level of credential. The largest completion gaps occur at the associate and bachelor's level, with 22 percentage point and 18 percentage point gaps respectively. The closest gender parity observed at the certificate level, with 51% of females completing certificates and 49% of males. Of all the credentials completed by men, about 1 in 5 attained a certificate. It was about 14% for women. So the coordinating board data indicate that once enrolled, men and women exhibit different higher education consumption patterns. In 2016, men completed credentials within certain majors at higher rates than women. The following charts highlight popular majors and programs for students who completed a credential, and we grouped them for this purpose into male-dominated, female-dominated, and gender-balanced fields. For what you're seeing now, we selected 5 of the most popular majors among men, which showed the largest gender gaps, and we used our zip code to pull out this information. And what you see in front of you ranks by the size of the program, so we're showing total completions and then differences in terms of the male and female completions. You can see academic STEM programs and several technical programs top this list, whereas for engineering, for example, we saw 80% male completions. For precision production trades, we saw 95% completions. So here are the 5 majors with the largest female completions relative to male, and this list includes liberal arts, education, and health fields. It's important to note the large size of these female-dominated programs compared to the male-dominated programs. So our overall N is much larger in terms of these programs than the ones we were looking at for men. And finally, here's 5 majors where we found the most gender parity. Again, this doesn't include all majors. We just selected those that really stood out for differences or being the same. So when you sort the majors by gender, you can see gender matters when we look at wages because majors are an important determinant of future wages. The workforce earnings data presented here indicates which majors yield the highest earnings 1, 5, and 10 years following graduation. Some of this will look familiar. This is the data that we include in the almanac. The light blue bars show first-year earnings, then medium blue bars show the earnings increase after 5 years, and the dark blue bars show the additional wage increase, so the overall bar is the overall wage at the 10-year point. Of the 5 top highest earning majors, 4 can be described as male-dominated fields from the list we just looked at, including engineering, physical science, computer science, and math. So even though men are completing at lower rates, those who do complete have a strong return on investment. This concentration of men in high-return fields also suggests that male participation in higher education may be related to perceived future costs, benefits, and economic opportunities in ways that are different from female participation. So just a couple of takeaways from what's presented here. Male completion significantly trails female completion in higher education in Texas, which is consistent with national trends. Without more males completing credentials, we won't be able to hit our 60 by 30 Tex goals. While research suggests the related factors are many and occur throughout childhood, there's an important role higher education can play in closing gender gaps by encouraging male college readiness and matriculation to higher education, by addressing barriers related to gender for different majors, and by supporting completion for all students. Wage data tells us there's a lot of value to higher education, but the wages aren't the only reasons to be concerned about student completion for all students. We also know there are important social goods, such as increased civic participation, voting, and health outcomes that are associated with degree and certificate completion. It's important for everyone to have these opportunities.
I guess there's no further discussion.
Thanks for that.
Very interesting.
Mr. Chairman, can I make just one comment?
Yeah.
Ms. Eklund brought up the almanac, and I just want to let you know, next to my desk, I have the almanac, and I reach for it all the time, and I think that's just a great product that the coordinating board has. I just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And I do want to take a moment to thank staff for really diving into this data for us and taking a closer look. And we will continue to bring you data highlights on our various goals and targets.
I have a
Yeah,
question.
it was a very complicated and very good research done. There needs to be more research done, but anyway, thanks a lot for all the people that helped Dr. Julie Eklund getting this data put together.
Mr. Chairman, so I just wanted to ask one question before we leave that subject. You talked about the national averages and how we pretty much match up. Are there any states that really stand out where there is parity?
That's a very good question, and I'm going to we'll go back and look at that. Not that I'm aware of, but there could be more parity, and I'll be happy to take a look.
And are there any states really tackling this with great ideas, or they have any, has anybody else even set it as a goal?
I am not aware of that, no.
Nobody's recognized it as a problem except us?
There's been a lot of articles. There's certainly been a lot of articles written and people starting to try to understand this better.
Okay, thanks.
I think it's important, I think you said this, Julie, that, we won't achieve the strategic plan without making an impact here. So, I mean, my hope is that with this crystallizes, and all right, this is great information, now what the heck are we going to do about it? How do we change that and figure out, learn from best examples if there are those in other states, but we're not going to be successful without it, so we've got to do something about it, is kind of the urgency that I'm feeling when I see this, because obviously the numbers trending in the wrong direction is not part of the plan.
It sounds like understanding the labor market data and the alternatives that people are going to aside from higher education might be really helpful, and knowing about those patterns on a regional level as well. And
that's an excellent point. The other thing I think we need to look at is really understanding at what points in time we see men and women coming into higher education or returning to higher education. So we'll look at it more closely.
It's very complex, as you said, getting into this. And a few years ago, we were looking at the data because of the brief bump in the oil production and the cost of a barrel of oil. And so staff looked, and we were hearing about all these high-paying jobs for people directly out of high school, 80 grand, and we didn't really find that. We found a little, but what we had to come to terms with, a $25,000 job for an 18-year-old is a lot of money. And so part of what you have to bring to the table is some perspective in terms of what it means to people at different levels. And even some of the data in terms of graduates over 10 years can become complicated. So for example, if you look at biological sciences, which the starting salaries aren't that much, but some percent of those go to med school. I don't know how many, probably not a high percent. But after 4 years, are going to be earning, when they start a residency, $50,000 or $52,000. So even those folks who may have extraordinarily high incomes in 12 or 15 years, but their residency was going to range from 3 to 7 years.
Yeah.
And so there are those things that make it really complicated, but we need to learn how to not just understand it better ourselves, but to give a better understanding to students as they look at even these figures and say, well, there's no way I should ever major in history, when we know that there are some history majors who do extraordinarily well, but what are they doing? I mean, they're not history teachers, and begin to sort of flesh out an understanding of this. And that's part of what our marketable skills goal is about, is helping people understand those patterns better. But there's a lot of work to do. You're right about that, both of you.
Yeah.
Well, one thing we have to do is we have to address the rampant confusion that exists out there. You have one group of people saying that, like the Georgetown University people, that are college credential is almost essential to survive in the current and the future economy. Then you have another group of people who are saying that's not true at all. There are a lot of jobs that pay well that don't require a college degree. We hear that all the time, and a lot of young people are confused. There was a study that was noted in the New York Times and Washington Post and on all the news channels that over 50% of particularly families, disadvantaged families, ethnic minorities, over 50% of families have no information about college. They don't know the difference between 2-year and 4-year institutions. Another typical trait of these people is when they hear that UT Austin and Texas A&M are public elite universities that are as good as the privates, they begin to assume that they cost as much as the privates. If you hear that UT Austin is as good as Rice, people say, well, it must cost as much as Rice does. They don't know about financial aid, and I think you're absolutely right. I know from my experiences in working in high schools, which I used to do a lot, there is a segment of the culture in high schools that suggests to boys that doing well in school is not cool. And we've got to find a way to overcome that, but these numbers are scary.
Okay, so what is the group, characterize the groups that say college is not important? I mean, do they have an angle, or are they looking at hard data? Because that's surprising to me. Because the data you talked about the recovery, who got jobs after the recovery, it's pretty darn clear you've got to have some kind of education.
Well, I think a lot of trades. When we had that discussion about House Bill 5, I think 4 sessions ago, there were a lot of people that argued that college education isn't worth the cost, and that sentiment still lingers. There were an awful lot of people that simply drew a very stark dichotomy between the need to go to college and the jobs that pay well that don't require that. And my position at that time was, and I talked to any number of representatives of these skilled trade groups. I said, look, say that there are wonderful opportunities for students who don't want to go to college, but don't say, we don't need students to go to college, that colleges have been oversold. And I don't think there's any question that did some damage. And it still lingers. We don't know what the consequences and ramifications of House Bill 5 have been. So far, some of the data don't look very, very promising, but we've got a lot of things we need to find out.
To add one thing to the commissioner's remarks, remember that one thing we learned during closing the gaps, there, at least in Texas, I think the commissioner's talking nationally, but in Texas, there were a number of people that didn't understand that certificates that people needed for certain professions were actually college work at community colleges. And so there's that's right. I mean, it's very, very interesting. Of course, part of it, too, is people who want people coming directly out of high school and they may pay well, but the careers are probably capped at some point as well. But, and part of what the commissioner is talking about, too, was also related to our concern about debt, is so much of the national media talks in the context of the cost for private education and the debt incurred for private education. And we really have to counter all that in Texas. I mean,
Right.
I'm
there
glad the
was
commissioner
a
brought that up
cover
because it's a
story,
real
I believe,
concern.
on Newsweek that was exactly that. But it was talking about an Ivy League education, $250,000, $300,000 in debt when you get out, and is it worth it? And it was a very negative story about higher ed, but it really focused on that price that you would pay and how long it took you to pay it off, and really, you know, you can get a degree for much less money and much less debt.
And the fact is that even in those elite to very expensive private institutions, only a relatively small minority of those students pay the full price.
All right.
Often it's only half the students or less.
Yeah.
Thanks. It's a wonderful discussion. I see it firsthand in West Texas when the oil prices goes up. Young kids getting out of high school can make 60, 70, 80,000. So they're not very much motivated to go to college, driving a truck, you know, although long hours, you know, but 60, 70 is a lot of money for somebody who's 21 years old. Anyway, we want to move on to agenda item 5B is consideration of adopting the staff recommendation, the committee relating to the approval of additional revised measures for Texas Higher Education Accountability System. Dr. Julie Eklund, Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding, will provide a presentation on the process to update the measure and present the staff recommendation for final measure.
Thank you. So today I am bringing you the last group of revised accountability measures for approval, and these are our measures for our non-Texas and career schools. The accountability system, as you know, is a critical tool for communicating with stakeholders across the state about how our higher education institutions are performing. We have data, of course, for all our public institutions, but we also have data for 2- and 4-year career schools with a Texas presence. So you approved the measures for our public institutions in July, and today I want to tell you a little bit about where we are for our measures for career schools. Of course, we're bringing them to you for approval today. We refer to them in the system as non-Texas and career schools. For the most part, they're private, for-profit career schools like the University of Phoenix or Le Cordon Bleu College of Culinary Arts, but there are some select out-of-state public schools and privates included, such as Arizona State University and Tulane, if they have a program with a presence in Texas. So the career schools were added to the system in 2011. We don't collect quite as much data for these institutions, but we were interested to see that according to a survey by the State Higher Education Executive Officers Organization, Texas is only one of 9 states that collects data from private for-profit institutions. Recently, also, Texas began participating in SARA, the State Authorization Reciprocity Agreement, in which states agree to acknowledge the accreditation status of institutions in other states. This is for online programs. And while this is a useful arrangement and reduces costs for institutions across the state and the country offering educational opportunities for their home state, we now collect data on few out-of-state schools as part of our accountability system because of SARA. But we will be starting to get data from the SARA agreement about what's happening with the students enrolled at those in those programs. So just a reminder, there were two primary reasons where we decided it was important to revise the accountability measures, to align them to 60 by 30 texts, and to reduce the number of overall measures to really focus on state priorities. And the same was true for our career and and for-profit schools and schools that don't have a presence, that schools from out of state that have a presence in Texas. So this slide just shows that we went through the process of reviewing the measures. We began in September 2016. Traditionally, that's when we bring in our accountability groups for our career schools. They spent a year reviewing measures, providing feedback. We've had a number of opportunities for that, and so now we're at the final stage of bringing these to you for approval. The career school data is accessible right on the accountability page. You can see the yellow box there shows you where we have that drop down, and so you can see measures for our two-year institutions, two-year career institutions, and our four-year institutions. They're separated out. In terms of our goals, the educated population measure doesn't track outcomes at individual institutions, so that is not included for the career schools, but the completion goal does. This is where you see most of the career school measures. So we look at the production of credentials from our career schools. Those are our certificates, associates, bachelors, and masters. Those targeted. We also break it out by our targeted 60 by 30 text populations, Hispanics, African Americans, males, and economically disadvantaged students. The only group that actually we don't include for the career schools is for those who are economically disadvantaged, because we don't collect data about student debt and from that group. We do, although, have some information from iPads about the students at those schools who receive Pell. So that's the information we're able to provide about economic status at those schools. Also, to provide more context for measures related to completion for these schools, we also look at institutional graduation rates and persistence rates. In terms of the 60 by 30 text marketable skill goal, the participation in this goal is voluntary for non-Texas and career schools. Some of them were interested in looking at their marketable skills, so we encourage them to be involved and provide information. What we do include in the measures for these schools are focus on workplace outcomes, such as the percent of students we find working or enrolled within 1 year after completion, and we also have data for pass rates on certification and licensure exams. In terms of the student debt goal, again, we don't collect debt information from those students, but we do have tuition and fee information included in our measures for those schools. And we also have some sector-specific goals where we look at expenditures per full-time student equivalents. We provide information about student-faculty ratios and information about faculty diversity. And just in a final note regarding what's presented in the accountability system, we are happy to get data from our non-Texas and career schools. We greatly appreciate the data that they provide to us. We recognize this as an additional burden from those institutions, but we're pleased that they are happy to participate and have been included in the system. So I gave you a spreadsheet that has all of the measures that you're going to be addressing today in terms of approval, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah.
Questions?
I've got a question. So why don't you collect student debt information on these schools? Well, look, so I just read in the New York Times this morning, the Department of Education is, I guess, working with Congress. They have a draft 550-page higher education bill, and there's a lot of stuff in there. A lot of it I didn't understand, but one of them was there is a requirement in the Obama administration that to get funding, you couldn't have more than 90% of your tuition covered by student debt, and they want to eliminate that. So in other words, it sounds like, this pendulum, and it's real complicated, but politically and everything, but it sounds like this pendulum in the Trump administration is going back to this, well, hey, these for-profits are great. They're trying to eliminate semester credit hours, as a measure. I don't understand. Anyway, but student debt's really important because that's a big part of either the argument that these schools are not perhaps worth it, or perhaps they do a better job. I mean, in other words, so anyway, is there any way to get student debt?
I think you raise an interesting question, and we do not collect the debt, but what you're suggesting is that I think there are other sort of surrogates that we could pursue from the federal government. For some of these schools, say, for example, Tulane, the students in Texas are a small subset of what that overall data would be that the federal government would have. So, but it's not something we collect. We don't have in our rules to collect that data. A little baseline for this that Julie didn't mention is that when we opened the door more to career schools about a decade ago, one of the agreements with those schools was that they provide for us unit record data. So much of what we do is calculated in a similar way to what we do at public universities because we have a record for each of those students in Texas. We don't have similar data for schools like Tulane or Arizona State. And part of that process was not collecting.
Attainment.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? If not, I need a motion and a second, please.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Motion, agenda item 5B is approved. We move on to agenda item 5C, is a report of space usage efficiency. Mr. Tom Keaton, Director of Funding and Resources Planning, will give a brief presentation and will be available for any questions and answers. This is for information only, please.
Good morning.
Thank you.
This presentation will attempt to provide greater understanding to one of our facility standards, the space usage efficiency metric. Our 2017 collection and analysis are underway, and we're hoping to orient you before the publishing of that report, so as you read it, you'll be able to be more informed. Essentially, we're going to talk about why we do it, what it is, how we do it, what the product looks like, and how useful and how easy it is to use. By statute, one of the key responsibilities of the Coordinating Board regards space utilization and maximizing efficiency in the use of education in general buildings and facilities. Texas Education Code Chapter 61 also outlines 4 key areas that should be used to review capital projects. The chart you see on this slide may look familiar. In fact, you'll find it in the next item on your agenda. SUE evaluates the use of space by considering classrooms and laboratories independently and is calculated for the general academic, state colleges, and technical state colleges, Texas State Technical Colleges. Prior to 2008, the Coordinating Board calculated only classroom and laboratory utilization, and it was not tied to a project standard. It was only an informational metric. In 2008, the Coordinating Board, in collaboration with institutions of higher education, created SUE. Room utilization is a widely used and accepted bellwether for overall space efficiency. Methods to calculate it vary from the very simple to complex. Ours is relatively simple, the number of hours taught in classrooms or class laboratories measured in hours per week. The percentage of seats filled when a classroom or lab is in use is critical to evaluating the efficacy of the scheduling effort and to inform the capital development process. When only utilization is used, if 2 people are using a room with a capacity of 100, that room is considered optimized. The number of activities that traditionally require classroom-type spaces and other laboratories, a number do. However, the combination of the requirement for more flexible learning spaces and potential efficiencies realized by using other spaces suggests the need for a measure that will capture this reality. The demand measure compares the need for classrooms and laboratories to the inventory of each. Whoops, excuse me. A large amount of data are collected and analyzed, but are of limited utility unless converted into usable information. By indexing each of these scores, they can be combined into one usable result. While this score may bring attention to an opportunity, Sue provides much more detail. And as we go forward, you'll see how you can look at it from a highly aggregate, I would dare say a 50,000 foot view, right down to the actual individual class in each room, going through this, and you'll see this going through the process. Due to the sheer size of the state, it takes a large shift to show a minor change in the statewide data. Here we see the data following an upward trend for classrooms. Institutionally, at an individual institutional level, the changes will be more dramatic. And for class laboratories, we've seen the scores remain relatively stable. The next three graphs are the next level of detail that can be used to assess the efficiency of space use. The chart shows time of day and day of week distribution of activity. The black line at the top shows the total number of rooms, either classrooms as you see on the left or classrooms on the right, that are available for that either institution or if the measures for the statewide data. The colored lines indicate days of the week, green for the weekends, blue are Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and red are Tuesday and Thursday. They're color-coded that way because that's a traditional scheduling pattern that occurs. This example is what you would see in a high-scoring institution. In fact, they scored a maximum score of 200 points on the measure. And you can see how it's balanced, and it fills a great area along in the graph. Some institutions have more activity in the evening than the day. This may present an opportunity for collaboration with other entities or institutions, or to have the available space used to create a potential revenue center at the institution's discretion. And of course, some institutions do better than others. While we see here an evenly distributed and coordinated pattern, it's quite obvious the inventory or number of rooms available exceeds the need for that number of rooms. Even more detail is available for institutions to make improvement. While many scheduling systems provide these type of data, none provide the tabular and the graphic data that can be used to compare across other institutions in the state without regard to the system that they use on that campus. Since the implementation of SUE, we've seen increased interinstitutional alignment, better data symmetry, and expanded intra-institutional collaboration. The best performers make efficiency part of their culture, and the SUE is a component of those efficiencies. With the data provided by SUE, institutions can assess these facilities at a building, a college, a department, or even the room level. These capabilities create an effective support system for decision-making at benefiting higher education across the state. And thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Yeah,
Any questions?
so we don't have any authority over these facilities anymore, but the institutions use this stuff. In other words, I mean, they actively say, well, hey, can you give me the data on what my space utilization is in this particular institution, and they're interested in it. It's a tool for them.
That's absolutely the case, sir. Rarely when we go to visit the institutions on site visits as part of the inventory verification, it's rare that we don't have a discussion prompted by the institution about their SUE score and about the efficiencies that they have.
So they view it as a resource, you know, and this is something we're doing to help sort of overall efficiency, space utilization, and it's being implemented even though we don't have power.
I think, and I think that goes to the nature of the statute as presented in the first informational slide, that's part of our role. And I would say across the state, yes. Are there institutions that don't see it as useful? Obviously, I mean, it's a diverse constituency.
Go ahead.
John, you've got these different categories of institutions, those that are highly efficient, those that are average, and those that have a ways to go. What percentage of institutions fit in those categories? How many highly efficient campuses do we have? How many average? How many low performing?
we talk about them for the slides here. We don't really make an assessment and have a scale to say this is high, this is low, this is medium. We look at it as, passing at 75% or 75 points per room, or 150 on the aggregate. I would say we're probably 30, better than half are passing. I'd have to get those exact data, and I don't have them in front of me right now on the actual numbers and the distribution. But again, we have seen it improve.
Well, my second question is that, given that that there is a correlation between space efficiency and the overall cost of higher education that is in one way or another passed on to students, how can we use these data to help us better achieve the goals of 60 by 30 Texas?
Well, I
Are we
think
using these data as well as we should?
I think, as a source of information, and as I talked about, being a decision support system and making it part of that process. When you look at one of these graphs, as you see up here, the area outside those lines, I mean, that's the area outside the curve. Those are the potential opportunities. Now, is that going to fit each institutional reality and the population of that? That's a difficult choice. Again, you go back to this is a commuter campus. They're probably not going to get the number of students during the day that they're going to get at night. Yet they still show as being a good performer. They meet the standards in all categories across the board. So I think there's a couple ways. One is identifying opportunities, especially in the same physical proximity for collaboration between courses. We do see some of that. It wouldn't appear here with community colleges. How widespread that is, I don't know, because we don't have the statutory power to get the community college data. But anecdotally, we know that that is occurring. So that's one way to do it. I think another one is looking at it and going, just the why. Again, we look at this example of a high scoring. Well, it doesn't escape the eye that Friday drops off a little bit.
A lot, actually.
But again, what's interesting is we've always had, or traditionally, a Monday, Wednesday, Friday scheduling pattern, Tuesday, Thursday pattern. But interestingly, you note that Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday are almost identical. So does that fit the institution's population? Have they adjusted? And there are a lot of things with this scheduling. Well, that frees up time and effort, whether it's faculty doing research or students doing other things or classes being held in a hybrid sense. There are many permutations. But I think what it does to compel someone to act, it's more difficult, obviously. But through the information, I've noticed that, the people that are in the decision-making positions very seldom got where they are by failing grades. And just by showing and having that standard and then asking the question and compelling the thought and making it part of the decision, that's important. Because, and I agree that, if you've got facilities, you're paying to upkeep them. Had a presentation here at the board many years ago, but in a great book by a person named Harvey Kaiser, which said, building's the gift that keeps on taking. And they continue to cost money, and it rolls up in deferred maintenance costs. And the dollars spent on that underutilized classroom could be spent on some other endeavor, whether it's facilities or otherwise. So I think it's a bigger question than just how, it's not going to be a direct, it's going to be part of a larger effort and that goes to my last comment, making efficiency part of the culture. I think that's the critical point.
Is that what?
Is it part of the
No, it's something we should think about, but I do want to have, David, I do want to have an internal discussion about how we can use these data, the SUE, to better promote the affordability.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I do think we've talked before that it would make some sense to have an annual report. I mean, one thing we can do where we don't have authority, we do have data, and to have we had one attempt, but it was so detailed, at least I thought it wouldn't be useful to folks in how to do that. But I also wanted to ask a question for context. And I asked a few years ago, what % of our facilities on campuses are classrooms?
About 10%.
And I think that's an important
Well,
concept to have, is that this is.
If I could
classrooms
rephrase,
are fairly
classrooms-
small,
Classrooms and laboratories are about 10%.
are about 10%.
And laboratories.
Yes. So I think you need that as part of this context in terms of the facilities and the overall cost.
Well, this has been an issue that we've talked about for a long time, Janelle. Right. But it is all about the cost of higher ed and how all this factors in. So, affordability and construction, there's a lot of costs that go into that, and what are better utilizations of those resources from the state is a very, very important question. And I think having this data available and really doing something with it, we may not have the authority, Stuart, but by publishing it, I think it accomplishes what we would otherwise want it to do.
It looks like part of this is looking at weekly utilization. Are you also looking at kind of year-round academic calendars and whether these are kind of sitting empty during summer months?
Currently, we use the fall data as an indicator for the entire year. We don't calculate for the entire year. These data aren't reported to us. One of the things when we developed it, and I was fortunate enough to be at an institution when it started its development and then took a position at the coordinating board and finished it on the coordinating board side, this was produced with no new data from what had historically been produced. And that was a key thing that we worked on so that the transaction cost on the institution's part would be no increase. Obviously, the report itself has a cost, but to make sure there was no increase in either transaction costs or administrative demand. And we did that. In doing so, we only have the fall report. That's when the inventories, and that's when all the facilities data are collected. Could we do it? Yes, but that would be an additional report. And certainly, that's something that I know that we look at with close scrutiny. Would it tell us something terribly different? I'd venture to say maybe, but I'm not sure the bang would be worth the buck on that. But again, if directed to do so and that's deemed desirable, of course we would. I think it would be, I'm not sure we get a whole lot of bang for that buck. I think this tells the tale well enough.
Thank you. We're running a little bit behind according to time schedule. We move on to agenda item 5D is a report facility project that was submitted to the coordinating board. Dr. Julie Eklund, Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Planning, and funding is available for question. This item is for information only.
I'm happy that now you'll understand the SU score on these, so we wanted to provide that information since you'd had questions in the past.
No questions. We move on to agenda item 5E is a report of Financial Aid Advisory Committee activities. Excuse me if I don't say the name right, and Delisa Fox, Executive Director of Scholarship and Financial Aid at Texas A&M, and Chair of the Financial Aid Advisory Committee will present a summary of the committee's recent activities and will be available to answer any question. This item is for information only.
Good morning. Thank you for having me this morning. I'd like to first thank you again for the ability for the Financial Aid Advisory Committee to exist and for us to be able to work with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board with advice and recommendations and evaluation of state financial aid programs. I will say that your slides will be slightly different what you have printed. I did a few minor tweaks. But I'd like to begin with a summary of tasks that were completed this past year. Excuse me. The first one noted is actually a little bit of a continued work in progress. The Financial Aid Advisory Committee had been discussing the many reports that are submitted to the Coordinating Board for State Financial Aid Programs. So with that, the Financial Aid Database Report, which is one of the largest reports that we do, the subcommittee has been working with Deshae Reed and her team here, and they've done a fabulous job of working over that report, changing many of the data elements, and integrating the end-of-year reports that we submit every year for many of the state financial aid programs, along with the reconciliation of state programs. So for FY18, we'll go into a multi-cycle reporting 3 times a year. The first will be due January of FY18. So we are looking forward to the new report, and hopefully we can accomplish some streamlining and effectiveness with reporting, and also be proactive in reconciliation with the state loan programs. The second thing, we had a subcommittee that worked on a financial aid memorandum of understanding with the coordinating board, and that was led by one of our members and worked with the coordinating board, and we also worked with that subcommittee to pass the memorandum of agreement up through general counsels at a couple of the universities and come back with universal language and so forth to provide this memorandum of understanding, and now that will be a yearly process. There's one recommendation at this point to the coordinating board is to review again the record retention for state aid programs went from 5-year to 7 in the MOU, and the Financial Aid Advisory Committee has asked about a review to align that with the federal record retention program of 3 years. From information presented to the committee this year from the coordinating board, we do understand the concern in the 7 years that they had put into place with the MOU due to some reconciliation programs with some with the loans, college access loan, namely, and Beyond Time Loan program for the past couple of years. But we believe that at this point, with the financial aid database and the more frequent reconciliation, that we may be able to look then at taking the record retention back to align with the federal record retention timeline. In addition to that, we had a subcommittee this year that looked at the prior year FAFSA implementation that was implemented roughly a year ago. And we started talking about this and discussing it in relation to the March 15th priority date for state aid programs. So the subcommittee, after looking at things and discussions and collaborations, have, and I will note this at the end again, a recommendation to move the state priority date from the current March 15th to the January 15th deadline, beginning with FY 2020. There were also, oops, I went too far. There were also a number of presentations that were given to the Financial Aid Advisory Committee this year that were very helpful in a number of ways. One of the things that we had asked for is some information from the coordinating board on what is done to help student borrowers of college access loan and Beyond Time Loan program. Specifically on college access loan, I would say wanting to know what kind of due diligence was giving out to those students and information that was shared with students about loan repayment. That presentation was very helpful for us to know specifically what is going out to borrowers from the coordinating board. And then also there was a gentleman that came in from the University of Texas who presented on website readability, a very good presentation that was very helpful. I know many universities, one such as myself, has had that individual come and visit us. Many of our websites are written at a beyond a college level, and students and parents that are reading these websites, we need to take that down to, maybe an 8th grade level. And we speak in terms sometimes that we eat, sleep, and breathe every day, and then we forget that it needs to be more taken down to a level of understanding and clarity of what we're asking the students and parents so they can better understand aid programs, how they apply, and what the eligibility requirements are for the programs. So I believe that was very helpful for the committee. So we have a few recommendations to the board at this time. One, as I mentioned, was the changing of the state priority deadline to January 15th, beginning FY 2020. Also providing some guidelines for the implementation of SB 887, the student loan debt disclosures. Ginger Grossman here at the coordinating board has presented to us a couple of times. I know they are working on some guidelines and rules behind that. Some of the other suggestions were aligning state financial aid policy with federal financial aid policies. A couple of areas that we look at specifically is there's a question on the FAFSA that deals with controlled substance regulations, and specifically for Texas Grant and TEOG. There is also some different things that we have to do to resolve the controlled substance for those programs that are not quite in line with what we already do for federal programs. So if we could align those, I think for the students, it would be more helpful to them so that we can communicate effectively and they won't be confused if there is issues for either one of them and for any of the programs they're eligible for. The other is under satisfactory academic progress. We are required, institutions by the Department of Education, to have a satisfactory academic progress and to follow that, and it has different components. In the state aid programs, there are a couple of them that the financial aid, the satisfactory academic progress requirements are different, and aligning them so that students would be less confused as well as they maneuver through the financial aid programs. And currently at our institutions, when we're asking, well, you need to do your satisfactory academic progress appeal, and it's like, well, why did I qualify for this program, but I didn't qualify for this? And we explain the differences between the requirements and the programs. So. And one of the items that the board, that we wanted to put in front of the board, as we know, it's a touchy subject in many realms, but the continued support, the financial aid offices use the tuition set-asides for packaging for many needed students. We understand that is one of these subjects that's been talked about, especially last legislative session, and just that continued support. I think some important things that you need to know is we do have a subcommittee right now. It was formed at the end of this year, and we are looking at providing some legislative proposals back to the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. And I think some things that we need to make note of and look at as we go forward, specifically, looking at innovative ways to continue to shape the state aid programs. Currently, and you mentioned the 514-page bill, the Prosper Act that's coming about, changes that may be coming for the higher education for federal aid programs. There's a lot of things in the bill. They're talking about one grant, one loan, more counseling for students in the loan area and for the Pell Grant program. But I think it's going to be important for the Financial Aid Committee to kind of look at what innovative practices then we need to use and think about, and how do we shape things maybe for the state aid programs as we look at changes in the federal aid programs. I know one of the things that's been discussed recently is with Senate Bill 887. I think the student loan disclosure statements are one piece of things that can happen around reducing loan borrowing and reducing loan debt. And so I believe we need to continue to look at those areas. So that concludes my report, although I do want to publicly thank, again, the board and Dr. Chad Pools and his team here. They've been very helpful, as always, with the Financial Aid Advisory Committee, and we appreciate the opportunity as financial aid professionals within the state of Texas to have the opportunity to work with the coordinating board on the programs.
Thank you very much.
So SB 887, does that, wouldn't it sounds like it requires students to report debt, or somebody to report debt. Can you not just get that for the privates? In other words, we had this discussion, really asking David, you had said, oh, we don't collect student debt for the for-profits, right? But isn't it required? Is this SB 887?
SB 887 is requiring institutions now to send out student loan debt disclosures to students annually, to send it out to students annually. One of the issues that we have currently is we only have partial data for students at institutions, so we are unable to give the student the full picture. So as we go forward, one of the recommendations the committee has that coordinating board possibly work to provide us with state loan data so that we can make sure that we send the students the most accurate picture of their student loan debt.
Well, that seems pretty critical.
Yes, and some schools were doing this, but I believe as a whole, it's one piece to working with student loan debt. And so I think the committee will continue to look at other things and maybe we do look at other states and what they're doing surrounding student loan debt, not only at the institutional level, but possibly at the state level as well.
This is, David used to talk about this as far as an app, right? And why an institution or why somebody hasn't developed an app for students to really have the tools to really have that at right here on their device and have access to it. Has anybody done any work in that regard that you're aware of by any chance?
Some schools have provided ways for students to get to the data. The complexity is that students may have state loans, federal loans and alternative loans that are from private lending institutions, and there is not a place for them to effectively go right now to get all of that data in one place. So the Department of Education provides the National Student Loan Database System, but it is not inclusive of state and private lending in that.
So it just seems to me that there's somebody could develop that. I mean, that, okay, I've got to get my information from these 3 places, but I have a roadmap, a guide to help me accomplish that so that I then I do have it all at my fingertip. And I just know that this has been a priority. You know, we've talked about this as far as how important it is, and I think everybody recognizes that, and yet we don't have the tool that would be so, I would feel, would be so incredibly valuable to students to have right at their fingertips.
I believe Chad and the Financial Literacy Committee have actually discussed that. They're coming up next, so that might be a good question to ask.
And am I wrong? Didn't I remember that Western Governors University, I thought we saw a presentation at one of the meetings that we went to where they had done some work on that and actually had something along those lines. Does anyone else recall that?
Yeah, and one of the
I think there was some attempt by, is it Meteor, a couple of years ago to do this?
Yeah, Western Governors University has come in and talked to us about work that they've done. They haven't gone to the level that you've described, again, because of the challenges really amongst the private lending. The federal lending is very easily accessible. From a state standpoint, we're looking at ways of how we can open up that and provide that to institutions a little better. But the private lending is basically wherever they happen to go for their private lending. So it's very much based on self-reported data. But yes, Western Governors has definitely looked at some things, but there's not yet something out there that can pull it together for the student. It requires the student to assemble it for themselves.
And Chad and I have discussed it. If I could miraculously come up with an app, I'd like for it to also be able to tie in with the student's degree program, and as they're making decisions in terms of the next course, I usually say if you want to take that Nordic mythology, doesn't fit in your degree plan, you need to be aware it may result in $2,000 more debt if you do that, to help them do that. But that's a bit of a pipe dream at this point. But I know Arizona State has something they call I've forgotten it, that more on the advising side. And I've forgotten what it's, e-advisor perhaps. But there will be this segment that both individuals have talked about that's hard to get at. I will note that if you look in the almanac, that we, at least in the almanac in an aggregate form, are able to report debt that someone may have accrued at Blinn prior to enrolling at A&M or at ACC prior to enrolling at UT Austin. But so that's what's being discussed here in terms of, is there a way to provide that to the institution where the student currently resides, correct? So that they can advise students that they've got more debt than they just acquired at A&M.
Well, what we try to do, and I'll speak to my institution, because we have actually been trying to provide information to students, and we can pull in from the financial aid electronic record the total loan debt. So it would include whatever's been reported up to the National Student Loan Database, but that is focused specifically on federal student loan debt. So the state loan debt and any private lending would not be included in that. So this is Delisa Fox, just talking for Delisa Fox, but my thought process, and been doing this for many years, is the Department of Education should create and provide the mechanism for not only states that have loan programs to submit data, but also alternative loan lenders that would all feed into the database that the students are using, so it could be segmented out, and so that data would be available. A lot of schools do try to send out information as well to ensure the students know that if we are giving them a snapshot, which it is a snapshot at that time, it would possibly not include all the student loans that they've taken out. I know there's a lot to be done. And also whenever disclosures come out for the coordinating board on college access loan, when the disclosures go out from the federal standpoint on federal direct loans, there is information in there for borrowers so that they know where to go to keep up with student loan debt and so forth. But we do know that students go through things very quickly, and 4 years goes by and they're just doing the things electronically and accepting loans and going forward, and at the end sometimes aren't thinking, even though they're doing exit counseling. And again, we're trying to reiterate at exit counseling what avenues they have to ensure that they've encaptured all the student loan debt that they've taken out.
Thank you very much. Thanks. We move on to agenda item 5F. Is a report of Financial Literacy Advisory Committee activities. Co-chair Laura Ewing and Dr. Jared Pickens and Dr. Charles Pulse, Deputy Assistant Commissioner for Student Financial Aid Program, will present a summary of Financial Literacy Advisory Committee's recent activities and will be available to answer any question. This is for information only.
Unfortunately, Dr. Jared Pickens couldn't be with us today due to illness, so I am filling in for him on this presentation. He and Laura Ewing, who I will pass this over to very quickly, served as co-chairs for the Financial Literacy Advisory Committee. The FLAC was composed of 23 leaders representing student financial aid, higher education, K through 12, community-based organizations, and business and finance sector. And the committee convened in November 2016 and met monthly through November 2017. So the diverse group of people brought much experience and many ideas to the table, and ultimately culminated in strong recommendations that are in the report that was provided to you. As you're already aware, the 60 by 30 Tex educated population goal calls for at least 60% of Texans ages 25 to 34 to have a certificate or degree by 2030. An additional goal of 60 by 30 Tex is the undergraduate student loan debt will not exceed 60% of first-year wages for graduates of Texas public institutions. And as part of that goal, the FLAC worked very hard to identify really how to better advise students and parents on how and why to pay for training and education after high school. I'll turn things over to Laura to provide the recommendations that they came up with on this goal.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, thank you. Okay, first of all, looking at the current statutory guidance, to begin the discussion, FLAC reviewed what the state regulations are. There is current legislation that enforces financial literacy from elementary to high school. The question is, are there enough requirements to allow our students to make more informed decisions financially to determine why and how to pay for college? Based on state legislation, K-8 math teachers are to teach financial literacy based on the required standards. At the high school level, financial literacy is provided in the required economic course. However, this amount of time allocated to financial literacy is limited, as both micro and macro economics are discussed in the one-semester course. Also, students taking dual credit economic courses are not exposed to the personal financial literacy content. There is currently no requirement that a high school student is required to take a financial literacy course. However, current legislation requires that a one-semester course be offered. In regards to financial literacy in higher education, universities are required to provide some type of financial literacy resource, which can include a workshop, a website, a financial literacy program, or a financial literacy course. However, there is no current mandate that requires students to participate in financial literacy activities and/or courses. So next, core learning objectives, building knowledge. We will now turn our attention to three main areas that FLAC considers highly important. These main categories include building knowledge, conveying information, and building consistency. There are 6 areas that FLAC identified that would increase knowledge to improve student and guardian/parent understanding of how and why to pay for a training and education after high school. The 6 areas are benefits, cost, opportunities, funding, course selection, and student loans. These areas are important not only for people considering training and education after high school, but also for those who may support them with that decision, such as parents, family members, advisors, etc. The FLAC believes that more knowledge is necessary to help meet the state's goals. So next will be critical communication efforts. In addition to knowledge, the FLAC believes that all information needs to be designed to meet the readability level of students and parents wanting more information. The FLAC specifically noted the following. 1, the audience. People learn differently, so providing information through multiple channels and styles will help students gain a strong understanding of paying for college, reduction and/or eliminating debt, and completing their high school education their high education goals. Students who are first generation often lack the understanding of terminology needed to complete the paperwork and understand their financial commitment. Students of lower socioeconomic status may also experience similar difficulties. Understanding the audience and developing an approach appropriate for them is a major key to success. 2, readability, which was mentioned just a minute ago. The FLAC team learned that much of the terminology and language used in the preparation process for going to college is above the reading and understanding level of many students. They become frustrated and either quit applying or their application is completed in an incorrect or incomplete manner. That results in their not being accepted at the university. Sensitivity to appropriate language and terminology will provide greater access to postgraduate opportunities and success. This applies to both parents and students. Design. While solving for the readability issue is a very important step, there is also a need for the information to be provided in a format that is user-friendly and appropriate for students of today. 4, one-on-one interventions. There is a need for strong online resources, multiple apps, and other strategies to strengthen understanding. In addition, setting the goals for post-high school learning requires one-on-one intervention with people trained in guiding students and working with their parents. Recommendations. The FLAC believes that consistency needs to be put in place so that students and parents understand the clear message and tools the FLAC recommends. The first one is portable tool. Student education on saving and paying for college needs to begin at an early age, and the learning needs to follow them through their educational career. Providing a portable tool that allows students and families to record decisions and information as the student progresses through their undergraduate career will better prepare them for college. Identifying a portable tool for students and parents to use is an important step towards meeting the goals of 60 by 30. The emphasis needs to be on the student rather than the school or institution. 2, enhanced training. Educators need continuous training and learning on how to educate parents and students on paying for college and keeping their debt in check. Many educators lack the knowledge and skills to teach the content and need continuously updated training themselves. In addition, there is a need for a standardized and engaging course of study so that the educators have ready-made materials that are available across the state. 3, branding and partnerships. Establishing a brand that promotes the goals for which FLAC was established and encouraging organizations around the state to promote the brand will further promote the message, skills, and understanding. Building partnerships and understanding, building partnerships and branding across the state will provide an equally compelling message for the students. And there's more information on the strategic plan in Appendix A. Financial literacy model. By building knowledge, conveying information, strengthening the consistency of the message, and building a student path that offers consistency of the language, of the lessons learned throughout the state, Texas will have a reduced student debt and more students completing college. You want me to do that? Okay. All right. We hope that you have found that the FLAC recommendations are very helpful. We truly believe that these recommendations will help our children and parents and guardians in being more educated while also limiting large amounts of student debt. We have a great community opportunity in moving Texas to the top of higher education graduation rates, which will help the Texas economy. We are happy to answer any questions.
On to agenda item. Sorry, I didn't have my mic on. We move on to agenda item 5G1. Is consideration of adopting Commissioner's recommendation to the committee relating to the amendments to Chapter 13, Subchapter F, Section 13.101, Board Rules Concerning Authority, General Appropriations Act, Senate Bill 1, Article 3, Section 40, 85th Legislature, Regular Session. Dr. Julie Eklund, Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding, is available to answer any questions. Any questions and discussion?
No, this is pretty much cleanup, but it relates to the next two rules, so we included it in your materials.
I need a motion and a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Agenda item 5G, number 1 is passed. Agenda item 5G2 is consideration of adopting Commissioner's recommendation to the committee relating to the proposed amendment to Chapter 4, Subchapter A, Section 4.10, Board Rules Concerning Limitations on the number of courses that may be dropped under certain circumstances by undergraduate students. Senate Bill 1782, 85th Texas Legislature, Regular Session. Dr. Julie Eklund for Strategic Planning and Funding will provide a brief update and is available to answer any questions.
Yes, thank you. This rule, the prior one, and the next one all relate to changes related to Senate Bill 1782, which is the bill that allows those students returning after 24 months to have some additional excess hours and to drop an additional course, et cetera. We didn't have any comments about the rules themselves, but we did have a comment related to the process of institutions reporting those rules. We had a comment from Houston Community Colleges that basically suggested that we work with the Texas Association of Community College registrars and admissions officers to make sure there's a process in place for understanding those students that do have 50 hours and where this will apply. This isn't something they've had in the past the same way universities have had to track excess hours. It's newer for them, and we'd be happy to work with them and convene some kind of a webinar or session to talk through the best way for reporting this.
Any questions? If not, I need a motion and a second, please.
Motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion, agenda item 5G 2 is passed. We move on to agenda item 5G3 is consideration of adopting commissioner's recommendation to the committee relating to proposed amendments to the chapter 13, subchapter F, section 13.104 and section 13.105 board rules concerning exemption for excess hours and limitation on formula funding for repeated hours for attempted course. Senate Bill 1782, 85th Legislature Regular Session. Dr. Julie Eklund, Commissioner for Strategic Planning and Funding, is available to answer any questions. Any questions? If not, I need a second, please.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion 15G3 passes. 15G4 through G9 are on the consent calendar. Agenda item number 6 is the adjournment of this committee meeting, and I need a motion, a second, I guess.
I'll make a motion.
Second.
Thank you.
All in favor?
Aye. Any opposed? No. I don't want to see who wants to continue. Okay. I got,
Let's take a 10-minute break, okay?